people in Wyoming know, the retreat of the glaciers that has happened within our lifetimes. And, the climate effects are very evident across Wyoming. I mean, in Yellowstone, summers are projected to be 13 degrees hotter than the current average by 2100. Heat wave days in Wyoming are projected to increase by fivefold by 2050.
Hello, my name is Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about passion, purpose, and the human experience. Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with the generous support of the Wyoming Community Foundation. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Sherri Goodman. Sherri Goodman is a Senior Strategist at the Center for Climate and Security. Welcome, Sherri.
Good afternoon.
Well, thank you. And after reading your bio, as I was telling you earlier, it was just very extensive and in-depth and so much leadership in what you've done over the past years. And I want to know, for you to tell us personally about how you got into climate change and national security, how this became your passion and your work.
As someone who grew up during the Cold War, I was initially most concerned about what I saw to be the biggest challenges at that time, which was a bolt-out-of-the-blue nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. And in my early years, I dove deep into defense analysis, and I worked on the Senate Armed Services Committee on nuclear strategy and arms control to try to manage what was the most serious threat during the Cold War. And then I worked in the Department of Defense in the 1990s when we became aware that we had, in addition to the nuclear threat, we had other challenges, such as environmental challenges. And then in the 2000s, I began working with a group of military leaders on climate change as a national security threat.
Well, that's been a long road, really. And, because your background and growing up, when did climate change become so well researched and become even a national debate? And when did people just start really just getting into what are the facts and what is it causing and then involving the military? And it's probably been going on a lot longer than I can imagine.
Well, there's been research going on within the Defense Department and the intelligence community for decades, and it was not widely circulated and appreciated in the years ago. When I served in the Department of Defense in the 1990s, we were primarily concerned with cleaning up old military bases from hazardous and other contaminants and conserving natural resources and working to advance international military-to-military environmental cooperation. And all that work continues today. But as we moved into this current century, we became much more aware of changing weather and temperature patterns as they affect military operations and military activities. And so we gathered senior scientists from our leading institutions and spent a year with leading military, retired senior military from all four services in the 2006-2007 timeframe, which is the first time that really the U.S. military devoted a considerable effort to try to understand the national security implications of climate change.
And that's what I found what was so interesting is that it isn't just as simple as saying our climate is changing, but that how does it actually affect national security, the fact that the climate is changing?
Well, we frame it as a threat multiplier in that the changing climate, the weather, changing weather patterns are disruptive and add to other threats that we face around the world, whether it's terrorist organizations and extremist groups, and now being able to take advantage of displaced populations who have become displaced because food and water are increasingly scarce with growing drought and rising heat, or the extreme weather events such as the hurricanes and the wildfires that we now experience in our own country on a regular basis, so that we now actually have to position our forces, our military forces, to help support our first responders to either flooding or hurricane events or even wildfires, which affects our overall deployment of forces around the world.
And when you explain it like that, and in just those layman terms, it makes sense. But when you're, thinking about how those two things connect, until you really can understand and look at it from a military standpoint. And the other part of that is that, like you said, displaced populations and how that does become a threat to national security. And I know you're working at a very high level, but, going down the line, how do you perceive that the public is receiving these messages?
Well, I think people experience it where they live and how they carry out their life. So, people who live along the coast, for example, are seeing sea levels rise and coastal storms become more intense. If we just take as an example Norfolk, Virginia, where we have the largest complex of military facilities in the United States, perhaps in the world, this is now an area that experiences regular sunny day flooding because of a combination of rising seas and coastal storm surge and coastal inundation. And so they have to adapt and change their practices just to enable people who live in the community to get to base sometimes because their roads are flooded. And people who are living out west, in Wyoming and other western areas have seen an increase in wildfires, increase in drought conditions, and increase in heat. And all of that is being experienced with varying levels of intensity at different places around the world. We live in an era of the greatest global migration since World War II. And I should add that, my own parents were Holocaust refugees and were fortunate enough to be able to migrate to the United States during that earlier vast wave of global displacement. Now we have people migrating for a variety of reasons, many of them fleeing political persecution and war and destruction, but much of that now is aggravated by growing drought and water scarcity conditions and food scarcity. People leave when they can't get enough food and water to take care of their families, or they can't maintain their livelihoods, whether it had been farming or herding, ranching. And we see that now increasingly in water-starved, parched regions of the world.
Just hearing that made me really depressed, but because it does sound astronomical. And what's going to help, really? What is going to help mitigate climate change? Well,
it's two sides of the same coin. One, we are in the middle of a vast energy transition, which we have been in historically, over many decades in the U.S. If you look at the transition from energy sources from wood to coal to steam to oil, nuclear power came along in the last century, and now we are able to move towards more advanced forms of energy, including renewables, advanced nuclear, hydro, and certainly we have a mix of fuels, but as all of that leads to a lower carbon energy future. So we need to up our game in terms of American innovation and ingenuity in advancing that. Much of that is happening already today in various parts of our own country and around the world. And the second piece of that is making our communities and our infrastructure resilient to changing climate impacts. And for example, that might mean in coastal communities, a combination of building seawalls, but also improving natural infrastructure, such as mangroves and dunes and beaches. And so it's a combination of built and the natural infrastructure. In drought stricken areas of our country, it's thinking more smartly about how we manage water. Countries, for example, like Israel, recycle the vast majority of their water and have turned a desert, made the desert blue over the last half century. We have the ability to recycle and be much smarter, for example, in our water use. And I believe those kinds of innovations, as well as moving towards smart, low-carbon policies, will help us build a resilient future. Also, we have more foresight today. You know, although we face this unprecedented risk from climate threats, we also have greater predictive capability. And some of that, you know, also occurs at research labs, even in Wyoming, where we are learning as part of the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. We're learning how to advance weather forecasts. And, you know, already in our lifetime, weather forecasts have gone from being reliable for 2 days to being reliable for 6 days. An improvement that I think most Americans don't appreciate. And that's because of our advances in science and technology and predictive capability for weather. We're now being able to approach more of a 2-week predictive capability, what's called seasonal to subseasonal forecasting. And with that comes smarter ways of managing both responses to extreme weather events, but managing every sector of society, how you plant, what you plant, transportation, water management, various forms of ranching, other types of farming. And that's going to change much of society as we have this improved predictive capability to understand better the changing weather, the more rapidly changing weather cycles in which we now live.
Yeah, and I think change is slow. I think it's changing behavior. And I think that takes a lot longer than just understanding, you know, how you're predicting the weather. And you're right, I actually don't appreciate it. I always think, okay, I'll read the weather, but I bet tomorrow when I go online and read it again, it's probably going to be different. So I'm very skeptical. But I still am trying to understand how we, at a grassroots level, change behavior for, like, say, green gas emissions or the use of plastics in the environment, or just, you know, some of the really habitual things that we do and can't appreciate how it affects climate.
Right. Well, you just raised a great example. I mean, in sort of plastics, right? Plastics are pervasive throughout society.
Right.
We know how much harm plastics, everything from, you know, your plastic bag to your plastic straw to larger uses of plastics, how much pollution that has caused, both particularly in our oceans, to marine mammals, to seabirds, to others. And so every little small step, whether it's in your house, whether it's recycling or not using plastic, or whether it's greater policies that reduce the role of plastics in various types of uses. All of that matters, from the individual action to the larger policy initiative. And, from my own experience in the Department of Defense, I see how important and powerful it is to model and to lead by example. When I first joined the Department of Defense in 1993, we didn't have, for example, recycling of paper in the Department of Defense, because at that time it cost a little bit more to buy recycled paper than to buy non-recycled paper. And initially I had a hard time convincing the leadership in the Pentagon that it was really worth the largest office building in the world using recycled paper. But I kept pushing at that. Finally, I did an Earth Day event with the Secretary of Defense, and we had a recycling event. And after that, all the paper was recycled. So, and that spread throughout the Department of Defense. And those kind of policies and practices can be modeled both at big scales, like in the Department of Defense, and in individual communities. In Wyoming, you have many smaller communities, and many of them can lead just by their own practices. And I've seen those initiatives when I've been out in some smaller Western communities.
Yeah, and it is happening, and that's why I just get really concerned in terms of, on that real basic level of human behavior. What are we doing to change human behavior or to educate people? Or even, just like in Jackson, they have no plastic bags at the grocery stores or any place. Anywhere you go, you have to use your own bags. And I think sometimes in order to change behavior, you have to, as communities, say, okay, we're not going to use plastic bags in our community anymore, because that will be the only way to truly change people's behavior.
Well, that setting standards and rules of the road can be very helpful in improving behavior, and also enabling people to see the costs of their actions. So that's also more openness and more disclosure is also very, very helpful.
Well, my last question, because I understand that you have this expertise on the Arctic, and one of the questions that we had always planned to ask you, because you are an expert on the Arctic, is what do you think the Arctic's going to look like in 20 years if nothing changes in terms of carbon emissions?
Well, the Arctic is where we're seeing the most dramatic effects of the changing climate. Sea ice is retreating, permafrost is collapsing, and temperatures are rising. We will likely have ice-free summers in the Arctic within the next quarter century. And that means a lot more transit and shipping and human activity in the Arctic. And that's deeply concerning. One, because the U.S., for example, is not yet really prepared to operate in an ice-free Arctic. We have limited ice-breaking capability now, although we are building our first new icebreaker in a quarter century right now. But Russia has 40 icebreakers and is building more and has floating nuclear power plants and sees the northern sea route along its coastline as an Arctic toll road for shipping and transit in the future. Even China has a very deliberate Arctic policy and strategy, creating a polar Silk Road, bridging its Belt and Road Initiative around the Arctic, and being able to ship from Shanghai to Hamburg and ports in Europe in the future. So the world is changing rapidly, and we have to be prepared for those changes, and that's very, very important.
It's so serious. I mean, you watch any shows, documentaries on the Arctic, and it's just mind-boggling that what is happening at the rate it's happening. And even here in Wyoming, where we have so many glaciers, and the studies that they're doing about the glaciers that are melting and deteriorating and going away. So,
yes, you've seen, I mean, people in Wyoming know, the retreat of the glaciers that has happened within our lifetimes. And, the climate effects are very evident across Wyoming. I mean, in Yellowstone, summers are projected to be 13 degrees hotter than the current average by 2100. Heat wave days in Wyoming are projected to increase by fivefold by 2050, from about 10 to about 50 days a year. So those are very real impacts. And wildfires, for example, are now 10 times more common than they used to be. And the area burned is up to 40 times greater in Wyoming, in Idaho, and in Montana. And there's also projections of an increase in the severity of widespread summer drought, increase of approximately 40% by 2050. And that's going to affect many people across Wyoming. So these are all happening now, and that's why it's important that we understand how to build a more resilient future and move to a low-carbon future.
Oh my gosh, it's been so great talking to you, Sherri. And I really look forward to seeing you here in Jackson. And thank you for your time. And I want to just say that the Jackson Hole Global Forum 2020 Climate Change National Security, Sherri will be one of the presenters March 16th and 17th in Jackson Hole. And we want you to register and go to jhcga.org. And that is the Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs website. Thank you, Sherri. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Emmy. You too.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.